Hey Steve, this is Dan Esposito from Guardion. I know it's been quite a long time since we last spoke, so I'm going to try to condense a year's worth of our effort and our journey so far during our phase one in about 5 to 10 minutes. So briefly, our focus has been on phase one and the development and identification of the ideal 2D nanomaterial-based structure and sensor layout for a ultrasensitive ion sensor. Now, the original purpose of this phase one was focused on mass spec. I'll get into a little bit later about why we pivoted away from that and into vacuum sensing. But at its core, what we were looking to do and what we've been able to do is demonstrate reproducible, robust chip-scale, uncooled, low-power, nanomaterial-based ion sensors. We didn't quite get to the signal-to-noise ratio above 5, kind of depending on device, and we didn't really go after the single-ion instance anymore based on our pivot. But we were able to demonstrate a large dynamic range of the sensor, able to operate in vacuum, open air, and under various gases. And they've actually been quite robust, meaning I don't have to keep them stored in any precious kind of container. We've exposed them to a tremendous amount of ion fluxes. They've been exposed to different radiation sources, and they keep on ticking. It's been pretty great. And they're able to distinguish positive and negative ions, which is pretty important for device reset and a few different other reasons. Now, where we walked away with all this is we identified that graphene is going to be the best material for us to move forward with for two different reasons. One, it was a great performer in terms of ion sensitivity in both atmosphere and vacuum, but we also were able to find and identify a fabless manufacturing path forward using graphene versus something like molybdenum disulfide. And I think for the development pathway that we would like to go on with this business, it makes a lot of sense to go in that direction. On the commercial side of things, we did over 200 customer interviews during the course of this phase one, and we've done a ton before that, but really focused on mass spec at the beginning, and we transitioned into IMS, or ion mobility spectrometry, and vacuum sensing. Big key takeaways here would be the pivot towards vacuum sensing. On that end, we've got letters of support from Atlas Copco, Agilent, company Digivac, who has a NIST-calibrated lab, or certified lab, that we're able to send some devices to, and a company called Sense4 that used to be essentially all part of MKS. But now is their own unit. We begin investor relationship building. We've gone to 3 pitch events. We've had 5 follow-on pitches, and I actually just heard back about 2 minutes ago from Saint-Gobain Crystals and Saint-Gobain Corporate Venture Group that we're going to have our 3rd meeting in the first week of March. So we're really exploring how we can look at getting this funded in addition to the de-risking that we need to do technically. And like I mentioned, we found a company, Graphenia, who is going to operate as a foundry service for us, specifically with graphene. I just met with the CEO very recently and have a foundry meeting with them on Monday. They've been in business for 10 years, and they're doing about $2 million revenue right now. They have a decent amount of support, and I believe they're going to be able to last at least for the time that we're going to need them. Now, long term, maybe fabless won't be where we go, but for the short term, I think this is a really cost-effective way for us to move forward and really start testing the actual market. So as a whole, we've done a huge amount of customer discovery work in a variety of different areas. For here, we were focused on mass spec, but as I mentioned, pivoted to vacuum gauges. We pivoted there because we kept getting suggested that we look at vacuum, which is something we hadn't even considered, over and over again. And then as we started talking to people in that space, it just seemed like it made sense. A strong commercial pull, people willing to spend a lot of time meeting with us. And so that's where we've headed. It's about a $450 million market, and we've kind of come to this number in 3 different ways and triangulated on that market size, because unfortunately it's not something where there's all these free market reports on. This is from looking at sales of high vacuum and ultra high vacuum pumping equipment. This is from direct conversations with customers and potential competitors at these different conferences, and then even some third-party market research, like through Dawnbreaker. The problem in a nutshell is you typically need to have multiple different gauges because they don't operate over the entire range. And it's looking like we've got the possibility to really develop a tool that can operate from atmospheric conditions all the way down to high vacuum. It eliminates a lot of the complexity in terms of the cost, having to have multiple units. The ability for this to be low power is another thing that's kind of come up surprisingly, especially from crystal growers. The ability to have these battery operated would be interesting, so they don't have power outages affect a 3-week growth process. And a few different other areas, easy to replace, and I think the COGS on product like this could be really interesting compared to what's in the market. How we're planning to enter the market is kind of two main ways. After a lot of talking, we probably won't be looking to sell directly to the semiconductor group. This might be a more updated version of how we'd be looking at this market. Essentially, what we would do is either focus through joint development with the mid-tier, like the Edwards of the world, and sell them into system integrators and fit into that pathway, because the semicons are a bit adverse to risk. However, during all of our customer interviews, we definitely found a lot of places and people willing to start throwing our devices into some of these kind of smaller IoT or car part related semi-fabs. So there's a lot of areas that we can go and look at to either approach direct sales method or through joint venture. Our team, you've been exposed to us before, really briefly. Nanomaterials is our background. Carbon nanotubes for myself, and then I went into business development. Swastika and June are experts in their relevant field about advanced nanomanufacturing, nanophysics, and sensors. We've been able to build a nice support team around us. Warren Katz is the managing director of Techstars, a successful CEO and angel investor. Bill is a former VP of engineering and business development person. He's an MIT Sloan fellow. He's been helping us a lot in consulting on the business development side of things. And upon raising a round, we'll be looking to join our company. And he's sold into it took a startup into the sales of the semicon industry and exited that company. Bob Jackson is an ion expert. He's a mass spec expert as well in terms of instrumentation design, and ion optics is becoming more and more important to the type of work we need to do moving forward. Funding pathway, simply we're going after this NSF Phase 2. We think it's going to be critical, and looking to raise a round following on this work as we kind of push the technology a little bit closer to engineering prototypes as part of our Phase 2. I've got a detailed breakdown of what we've done kind of by March, or at least summaries of each month. I'm not going to go into any of them fully here. I'd say the biggest takeaways would be we kind of had our eyes opened at ASMS when a couple people started mentioning vacuum sensing over and over again. We did have some really interesting interviews, or kind of third meetings actually, with Waters and their mass spec R&D team, which if we went in that path would definitely be a partner we'd want to work with. Hamamatsu we've met with many times now, and even had their corporate venture group visit us at our office. We've then kind of pushed through. We actually had Andrew Chu, who's applications manager of Atlas Copco, who owns both Leibold and Edwards. So he came down and actually spent an entire day with us. We went and did some demos. We went and had a deep dive on the technology, talked about maybe future collaborations, and wound up leaving us a letter of support. Continue to develop and start testing more in the vacuum range. Started pivoting towards a bigger focus on graphene. Looking at team expansion around here in September. More vacuum testing, high-speed sampling, data design. Now, this is an area of research we had outlined originally. We did go down this pathway, but we wind up not pursuing the actual build of some of the more complicated electronics, just because it doesn't make sense for the new market we're focusing on. We got some more letters of support, as I had mentioned, from a NIST-certified lab for vacuum testing that we hope to be using towards the end of Phase 2. Around there, we got some more letters of support. We began doing a lot of outreach and pitching, which has been great. We've had second meetings already with Skylight VC, Hamamatsu CVC, and as I mentioned, we're having our third meeting with Saint-Gobain CVC Group in the beginning of March. I'd love to get your feedback on the kind of risk factors with working with the CVC if you have any experience, but other than that, we're just kind of getting warmed up in this area. We're not really raising a round right now. All right, and then in January, we continued our experimentation, testing in different gases, working on device reset, even exploring different methods of ionization. In a longer conversation, I'd love to get into a deeper conversation about what's been happening in terms of our vacuum testing and setup. But overall, we're feeling pretty good. And we continue to have a lot of the early work we were doing for outreach keep coming in, even though they're in different areas. So mass spec, IMS, we've actually hosted a lot of people here now that have been kind of following through with us over the last couple months. We're looking to move towards phase 2, expand our team, do more vacuum testing. And I want to take a brief little bit of time to go over maybe the most worthwhile discussion of data. Really quickly, you can see in the top left what an ion sensor looks like. One amazing thing is we're able to do measurement of ions from a pretty simple corona source from over 2 meters away, which really kind of surprised us. It was just, but interesting in its own right. The ion sensor itself, the graphene-based chips, you can see in the bottom left. And then an example of one of our setups with an ion gauge, an ion source that we've kind of converted from a different ion gauge, and then the distance of where our sensor is in the system. And we're detecting fluxes that are much below what's capable of being measured by a Faraday cup. So pretty interesting. We've been able to demonstrate with the somewhat limited system that we have for our vacuum chamber the ability to show kind of a linear response in pressure, at least when we're looking at it with a log change of pressure on the bottom. We then go ahead and take a look at where we can extrapolate our limits of detection would be. And this comes down to a basic function of how our device works. So the way you might want to think about it is it's kind of integrating the signal, right? So the longer we give for integration time, the better information we get out of it. So as we approach really low pressures, if we're able to increase the integration time or the measurement time of that sensor, we can extend what the lower limit of our detection is. We also were able to come over a pretty big problem we're seeing with saturation and device change in performance, but by controlling the flux reaching the detector, or by doing an external reset of the device, we're able to demonstrate that we can show repeatability with these chips in response to pressure. And then finally, one of the things we wanted to understand was the mechanism for ion release and what that does to the sensor. This test represents, I forget how many hours this was exactly, but essentially had a dual polarity ion source, so 2 different corona sources constantly bombarding our detector, able to show that the device was able to continue to operate, obviously with pressure changes in the room and a few different other reasons. There'll be slight variation in pressure, but the oscillation remains pretty much the same. Now what's important here is the total ion flux arriving at our device is significantly larger than the total available spaces or sites, you might be able to think of it, where ions could sit. Now why this is important is one of the things we wanted to identify was when we neutralize an ion, which could be a method for device reset, is it sticking to the graphene or is it removing? And it seems, based on the kind of characteristic response we're getting out of this, that it is in fact not sticking to the graphene and is actually moving and detaching. So it's pretty interesting and compelling in that area as well, but will definitely be explored a little bit further in phase 2. As we work on both the ionization source design, which will be a big part of the first push, what we do in phase 1, and then look at the system development and characterization testing. And that's what we've been doing in a year in a very fast way. I hope this was somewhat helpful and informal, and or a helpful and informal way of us to kind of get caught up. And we'll obviously be sending a more detailed technical report next week. And yeah, we look forward to working with you on phase 2 if we make it through. We're pretty excited. All right, thank you.